Have you ever felt unfairly judged just because of how you look? That's what a veteran faced at a cafe when she was suspiciously singled out just for carrying a bag. But instead of staying silent, she did what most wouldn't dare. She stood up for herself and demanded respect. This isn't just a story about prejudice. It's about the power of speaking up and making a change. Stay tuned to see how this story unfolds and the valuable lessons it teaches us all. A waitress refuses to serve a veteran at a busy cafe, calling 911 on her without cause. Little did she know, her actions would lead to a shocking and unforgettable moment of regret. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you must let us search your bag," the police officer stammered, shifting awkwardly under Elizabeth Carter's steady gaze. Sergeant Elizabeth Carter looked at her, more bemused than offended. Never in a million years would she have seen this coming. Not after serving her country and fighting for the very freedoms people took for granted. But here she was in a cafe, being treated as if she were a threat. It all started one chilly morning in downtown Portland when Sergeant Elizabeth Carter, a decorated Army veteran, entered the bustling Sunrise Cafe. The sun was barely up, casting a soft glow across the streets, but the cafe was already packed with early commuters and regulars. Elizabeth, fresh off a red-eye flight, was looking for a hot cup of coffee and a quiet breakfast to gather her thoughts. Little did she know, this morning would take a turn she never expected. Emily, a young waitress, was clearing tables when her eyes fell on her. At first, she noticed nothing unusual, but then her gaze lingered on the duffel bag in Elizabeth's hand. Emily wiped her hands on her apron and approached her. "Good morning," Emily said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Is everything all right? Are you looking for someone?" Elizabeth glanced around the cafe before responding, her deep voice steady. "No, just here for breakfast," she replied, moving toward an empty table by the window. Emily hesitated, her eyes darting back to the duffel bag. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'll need to ask, what's in the bag?" Her tone was polite, but beneath it was a threat of suspicion. Elizabeth set the bag down on the floor, her brow furrowing slightly. "Just my personal belongings. I've been traveling," she explained, her voice calm but watchful. Emily shifted on her feet, glancing toward the counter where her colleague, James, was watching them curiously. "It's just that we've had some issues with, security, with things happening in the news and all," she said, her voice trailing off as her gaze flicked nervously between Elizabeth Carter and the bag. Elizabeth's jaw tightened ever so slightly, though she kept her tone measured. "I see. But I'm not sure how my bag's a problem unless you think there's something dangerous inside." Emily blinked, startled by her directness. No, it's not that," she quickly stammered, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "It's just, well, you understand, right? With all that's going on these days, we have to be extra cautious." Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "Cautious about what exactly? My bag or me?" Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Emily didn't respond. Emily's eyes flitted around the room, searching for some form of backup. She spotted James near the espresso machine, watching the exchange closely. "I'm just following the rules, ma'am," Emily replied, her voice wavering slightly. "I'll need to ask you to leave." Elizabeth exhaled slowly, the patience in her voice beginning to wear thin. "Leave? For what reason? I haven't done anything but order breakfast." Emily, feeling the eyes of the other patrons starting to turn toward them, swallowed nervously. "Look, I don't want to cause a scene, but if you don't leave, I'll have to call the police." Elizabeth's expression darkened, but her tone remained controlled. "Go ahead," she said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "If that's how you want to handle this, call them." Emily, visibly shaken, fumbled with her phone. "It's protocol," she mumbled, more to herself than to Elizabeth, as she dialed. James approached, sensing the tension. "What's going on?" James asked, eyeing Elizabeth with thinly veiled concern. He turned to Emily, his voice dropping. "Is everything all right?" Emily nodded quickly but didn't meet James's eyes. I'm not sure." "She wouldn't explain what's in the bag," she said, her voice faltering. James glanced at Elizabeth Carter, his tone more measured. "Ma'am, if you don't mind, Can we have a look inside the bag, just to clear things up? Elizabeth's gaze flicked between James and Emily, and for a moment, the silence in the cafe was almost suffocating. Finally, Elizabeth spoke, her voice calm but laced with frustration. You want to search my bag because it looks suspicious, or because I do? The question hung in the air, uncomfortably heavy. James shifted awkwardly. Ma'am, it's not about you personally. It's just, we have to be careful these days. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. Careful about what? A black woman walking into your cafe with a bag? James hesitated, clearly not expecting Elizabeth to put it so plainly. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Elizabeth cut in, her tone sharper now but still controlled. Because I don't see you asking anyone else to explain their bags. A couple seated nearby exchanged uneasy glances, clearly eavesdropping on the conversation. The tension was palpable now, and several other patrons had begun to pay attention. Before James could respond, the cafe door swung open, and two police officers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room before locking onto Elizabeth. One of the officers, a tall woman with a stern expression, approached the table. We received a call about a disturbance, the officer said, her voice professional but curt. What seems to be the problem here? Elizabeth turned to face the officer, her frustration evident but contained. There's no disturbance. I'm just trying to have breakfast, but apparently, my bag's a cause for concern. The officer glanced at Emily, who stood wringing her hands behind the counter. She refused to leave, Emily muttered, her voice barely audible. The officer's eyes narrowed. Ma'am, do you mind if we take a look in your bag just to clear this up? Elizabeth let out a slow breath, patience hanging by a thread. I mind, she said flatly. Ma'am, with all due respect, you must let us search your bag, the officer stammered, shifting awkwardly under Elizabeth's steady gaze. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, her calm exterior cracking slightly. Or else what? She asked, her voice sharp but controlled. The officer, clearly unsettled by the intensity of her gaze, shifted awkwardly. Look, ma'am, we're just trying to follow procedure, the officer stammered. If you don't cooperate, we'll have to escalate this further. We don't want to cause a scene. Elizabeth leaned back slightly, her arms crossed. A scene? You mean the scene you've already caused by treating me like a threat for no reason? Her voice carried a quiet authority, the kind that comes from someone who had faced far worse situations than this. The officer opened her mouth to respond, but Elizabeth held up a hand, stopping her. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, Elizabeth said, her voice steady. Are you asking to search every bag in this cafe, or just mine? The officer glanced around the room, aware that all eyes were now on them. She didn't answer. Elizabeth continued, her tone calm but unyielding. I see bags over there, and over there, she said, nodding toward other patrons. Why aren't you asking to search those? The officer took a deep breath, clearly feeling the pressure. Ma'am, we're not trying to single you out. It's just… No, Elizabeth interrupted, her voice sharp. You are singling me out, but if it'll stop, fine. She unzipped the duffel bag and placed it on the table. Inside were neatly folded clothes, a few toiletries, and a framed photograph wrapped in a towel. Elizabeth carefully unwrapped the towel, revealing a picture of her and her fellow soldiers during her last deployment overseas. The room fell silent. The officer stared at the photo for a moment before glancing back at Elizabeth, her expression softening. You served? She asked, her tone more respectful now. Elizabeth nodded. I did, and this is how I get treated. Emily, her face drained of color, took a step back. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize. Elizabeth's eyes locked onto hers, the weight of her assumptions evident in her expression. No, she said quietly, you didn't bother to ask. The officer nodded, clearly realizing the situation had been a misunderstanding. There's nothing suspicious here, she said, turning to Emily and James. This woman's a veteran, and she has every right to be here. The patrons, who had been watching intently, began murmuring among themselves. Emily stood frozen, her hands trembling. I'm sorry, Emily whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't mean to. Elizabeth stood, her face calm but resolute. Intentions don't matter when you act on assumptions. Just as Emily began to lower her head in shame, a voice came from the back corner of the cafe. I think this has gone far enough, a man said, his tone clipped but calm. Heads turned as a sharply dressed man in his mid-40s stood up from his table. His gray suit and carefully styled hair gave him an air of authority, but there was something about his casual demeanor that made Elizabeth's skin prickle. The man approached, his steps measured, carrying a latte in one hand and a newspaper folded under his arm. His name tag, clipped neatly to his jacket, read James. Let's not blow this out of proportion, all right? He said, his voice smooth and practiced. We all make mistakes. Emily here was just doing her job, trying to protect the customers, right, Emily? Emily blinked, visibly thrown by her boss's sudden intervention. She glanced at Elizabeth, then back at James, as though searching for a way to explain herself. I didn't think it would get this far, she stammered, her voice shaky. I just thought. James cut her off gently, but firmly. You thought you were doing what was right, he said, nodding slowly. It's a tough world out there. Lots of people are looking to take advantage. You can't be too careful these days. His gaze shifted to Elizabeth, his smile never wavering. I'm sure you understand, don't you, Miss Harrison? Serena Harrison, Elizabeth replied, her voice still steady but her eyes narrowing as she gauged the situation. James nodded again, his voice turning almost patronizing. Of course, Miss Harrison, a veteran, right? We have nothing but respect for your service here. Emily meant no harm, I assure you. She was just being cautious, as we all need to be. Elizabeth remained silent, her expression unreadable. She could feel the weight of the situation shifting, not out of her control, but into something more slippery. James's tone was too smooth, and his explanations were too easy. This was more than a simple apology. You see, James continued, lowering his voice slightly as if to make the conversation more personal. We've had some incidents lately, suspicious folks walking in with big bags, people who don't fit the usual profile. Emily acted on that instinct, not because of you, but because of what we've experienced here before. His eyes flicked to the bag at Elizabeth's feet, then back to Elizabeth's face. You can't blame her for doing her job, can you? There it was, a subtle deflection, a plausible excuse wrapped in a veneer of reasonableness. Elizabeth's jaw tightened as she considered her next words carefully. I understand that people get nervous, Elizabeth said slowly, but that doesn't make it right to jump to conclusions based on appearances. You're saying she's just doing her job, but we both know that wasn't all it was. James's smile faltered, but only for a moment. What are you implying, Miss Harrison? I'm not implying anything, Elizabeth replied, her voice firm. I'm saying it outright. She looked at me, saw a black woman with a bag, and assumed I was trouble. The tension in the room thickened. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly picking up on the uncomfortable truth Elizabeth had voiced. But James didn't back down. I'm sorry you feel that way, James said smoothly, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. But you have to admit, with everything happening in the world, terrorism, theft, you name it, people are on edge. We can't afford to take risks, especially when we're responsible for everyone's safety. Elizabeth's eyes flashed with irritation, but she held her ground. Safety? I walked in here to have breakfast, not to cause a scene. If safety was the concern, you would have asked everyone about their bags. But you didn't. James's face hardened, but his smile remained. Miss Harrison, I think you're taking this the wrong way. We don't discriminate here. My staff follows protocol, and if you felt disrespected, I'm truly sorry. He glanced around the room, making sure others could hear his next words. But let's be reasonable. You understand how situations like this can be misunderstood. Elizabeth stood her ground, refusing to be swayed by the manager's polished rhetoric. Misunderstood? No, this was perfectly clear. And instead of owning up to what happened, you're trying to cover it up with excuses. James's eyes darkened, though he kept his voice even. I'm offering you an explanation, Miss Harrison. We've had to make difficult decisions here, and not every situation is black and white. If we start questioning every customer who raises a concern, where does it stop? Elizabeth's voice sharpened. It stops when you start treating people with respect instead of making assumptions. Emily, who had been watching the exchange with growing unease, suddenly spoke up, her voice shaky. I didn't mean for this to happen, she repeated, her eyes flicking nervously between Elizabeth and James. I thought I was doing what you wanted. You always said we had to be on the lookout for anyone who didn't look right. James's expression shifted ever so slightly, his veneer cracking just a bit. He turned to Emily, his voice lowering. Emily, I think you're confused. We never encouraged profiling. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed as she caught the subtle shift in the conversation. James was walking a fine line, distancing himself from any outright accusation while still maintaining plausible deniability. It was clear that he had coached his staff to be cautious, maybe too cautious, but now that it had backfired, he was trying to clean it up. Emily looked down, her face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. But you said, I said to be cautious, James interrupted smoothly, turning back to Elizabeth. But it seems like there was a misunderstanding here. Perhaps we can find a way to make this right. Before Elizabeth could respond, the door chimed. A woman in the back corner stood up, phone in hand. I've been recording this, she said loudly, her voice cutting through the room's tension. People deserve to know how you treat veterans here. Without another word, Elizabeth turned and walked out of the cafe, the door closing behind her with a soft chime. The next day, Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table, reflecting on the events from the previous morning. It wasn't the first time she had faced mistreatment, but this incident gnawed at her more than usual. Something about the way she had been singled out for simply carrying a bag, coupled with the assumptions made about her, felt different. She decided to share her story, not out of anger, but to raise awareness. Elizabeth began typing out a detailed post explaining what had happened, how it was more than just a misunderstanding, and how the assumptions people make can have real consequences. She explained how veterans like her are often judged without context and how moments like this are reminders of the work still to be done. She hit the post and watched as the story quickly spread. Friends, fellow veterans, and even strangers shared it widely, and soon local news stations reached out, eager to cover the story. Suddenly, the Sunrise Cafe found itself at the center of a growing controversy. Calls and emails fluttered in, demanding answers. Emily, the waitress, was overwhelmed by the backlash. She hadn't expected such a powerful response. What had seemed like a small, controllable situation had spiraled into a public relations disaster. Within days, the cafe's manager, James, issued a public apology, acknowledging their mistakes and promising to retrain the entire staff to treat customers with dignity and respect, regardless of appearances. They also announced a donation to a local veteran charity as a gesture of goodwill. But the story didn't end there. A week later, Elizabeth received an invitation from the cafe. They were hosting a charity breakfast for veterans, with all proceeds going to the Wounded Warrior Project. The invitation included a personal apology from Emily herself. At first, Elizabeth hesitated. She didn't want to relive the unpleasant moment, but she also recognized that the cafe was making an effort to right its wrongs. If her experience could lead to positive change, it was worth considering. The morning of the event, Elizabeth returned to the Sunrise Cafe. This time, the atmosphere was different. She was greeted warmly by the staff. Emily, looking pale but sincere, approached her cautiously. "I'm so sorry for how I treated you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've learned so much from that day, and I hope you can forgive me." Elizabeth looked at her, then back at the cafe, bustling with people, many of them veterans. "Forgiveness isn't what matters," she said gently. "What's important is that we learn and do better moving forward." The charity breakfast turned out to be a success, raising thousands of dollars for veterans and shedding light on the importance of treating people with dignity and respect, no matter who they are. As Elizabeth left the cafe that day, she felt a sense of closure. What had begun as a painful experience had turned into an opportunity for change, awareness, and growth for everyone involved. The lesson from this story is clear. Sometimes actions based on assumptions and suspicion can lead to unintended consequences. However, instead of letting misunderstandings and hurt linger, we can choose to learn, make amends, and create positive change. That's exactly what Elizabeth and Emily did, turning a painful experience into an opportunity for growth and mutual respect. If you found value in this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an inspiring video. Together, we can build a more understanding and compassionate community. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you agree that change starts with each of us? See you in the next video.